Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Kurt the Arborist. It's the Arborist Blueprint podcast. Today we have an awesome guest, Jen Llewellyn. If you made it out to ISA Ontario, you may recognize that name or her from doing a presentation on fungi and kind of how it's all connected to the trees and everything. So I personally love that kind of stuff. And it explains so much about trees, how they grow and how to keep them healthy, all that kind of stuff. So I connected with Jen. I wanted to bring her onto the podcast, and she's going to be on here today with us. What we're going to go over today in the podcast is a little bit about how trees grow and how they grow naturally, like in their natural environment. Things like the soil food web, the fungi, like I mentioned, why diversity is important and growing in a forest is so natural for them, and why I guess urban environments aren't as ideal and some of the challenges there, and why they're part of a greater ecosystem. We're also going to talk about some challenges that you have right from the beginning before you even plant, coming from the nursery, and how to plant them properly, in her opinion, in my opinion, that sort of thing. And maybe just how we can do better as arborists out there, in her opinion, kind of on the career. Jen is an ISA Certified Arborist, but not only that, she is a plant health expert, horticulturalist, and consulting arborist with beautiful trees and green bird horticulture in Caledon, Ontario. We'll clear that up with her. She works closely with her husband, Johl, to provide consulting services in tree care and tree protection. It's a new adventure for her. And prior to the spring of 2022, Chen was a Provincial Nursery and Landscape Specialist with OMAFRA. I'm not even going to pretend what that stands for. Maybe we can ask her. For 23 years. She holds a B.Sc and an M.Sc. I believe that's Bachelor of Science and Masters of Science in Horticulture from the University of Guelph. She's also an ISA Certified Arborist, as I mentioned, and now she's taken a new journey into a bit of personal coaching, like a personal empowerment coach or life coach, I guess you'd say. Jen is really passionate about trees, nature, mentoring, and has delivered hundreds of interactive lectures and workshops across the province. She's written extensively for many industry publications, including Landscape Ontario magazine, the Ontario Arborist, and the ONNurseryCrops blog. She's also co-author of BugFinder, which is a free ultimate scouting app for nursery and landscape professionals. You can follow Jen over at greenbirdhort on Instagram, or check her out online on their website is greenbirdhort.com. Okay, thanks so much for joining us. It's going to be a great podcast. The Arborist Blueprint podcast is proudly sponsored by Tree. Tree is a regenerative alliance founded by myself, Kurt the Arborist, that brings arborists together to plant more trees than we are removing. The 2-to-1 Tree Cycle program is an off-site tree replacement initiative that is funded 100% by small recycling fees that we charge our clients when they require a tree removal. These funds cover all costs from seedlings all the way to monitoring. There is zero cost to arborists that join the alliance. When you join the alliance, there are also multiple benefits for your business to take advantage of. Tree is a green marketing tool that can help you win more quotes and attract new conscious clients. We provide you with pre-made line item titles and descriptions for your quotes and invoices that explain the recycling fee and direct them to Tree for more information. We provide PDF info cards and thank you cards you can optionally attach to your quotes and your invoices. We offer a free branding toolkit complete with professional logos, badges to advertise your affiliation on your website through email communications or other social media channels. We'll mail you decals to add to your equipment that display the 2-to-1 Tree Cycle badge. We add your logo to our website with other Alliance members, which backlinks to your website. We also share collaborative posts through social media to advertise your new affiliation through Tree and Kurt the Arborist Instagram pages to boost awareness. If you are interested in more information about Tree, please visit atmostree.org and fill out our contact form. You can also follow us on Instagram at atmostreeorg. So please join our growing alliance of arborists and contract climbers from around the world. Together, we can make an impact and be responsible for planting more trees than we remove. It's free, and Tree takes care of everything. Thanks, guys. Now back to the podcast. Enjoy. Hello. Here we are.
Hello. It's good to be here. So good.
So good. Jinx.
So good.
Yeah. Hopefully, I mean, whether they do or they don't, a lot of people probably know who you are, more so than I do. I'm thinking it sounds like you've been in this industry for quite a while. I was just reading your bio out to everybody so they had kind of an idea of who you were. I didn't know what some of the acronyms meant, like the OMAFRA and whatever. And I'm pretty sure M.Sc means Master of Science. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I met you at the ISAO conference and you were doing a presentation on fungi. Do you remember the title of what it was called there?
Yes, it was called The Hidden Kingdom of Fungi.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
It was so awesome. I loved it. I couldn't resist but run up afterwards and introduce myself to see if we could chat again. I didn't know about what, but I just want to be your friend.
Yeah, I love having new friends. It's fantastic.
Yeah, it's awesome. Well, thanks for coming on. Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, would you give us your kind of own version of just some of your background and how you got into knowing the arborist community and how you're doing things differently? Was that a real bird, by the way?
Yeah. No, it wasn't a real bird. It came from a device.
Oh, okay.
All of my devices have instead of just synthetic ringtones of synthetic sounds, I've always got like a little nature clip in there. So yeah,
that's cool.
It's kind of one of those things.
Mine's actually a chainsaw sound, which is it's kind of cool, but it's not naturey at all. It's like the opposite of nature.
It's opposite of nature. Well, and speaking of which, I failed to do this before we started, so I'm just going to put my device on Do Not Disturb, and hopefully
no worries.
all those fantastic calls that I get from like the southern United States for I don't know what can just cease and desist for the next little while. Yeah, so I'm I guess I'm a horticulturalist. I'm a nature lover at heart, just like most of us. I grew up in a really small town north of Toronto, which is now like a bedroom community, of course, to the greater Toronto area. But we always had free access to nature. We grew up on the Humber River. We did every sport that we could think of. I have 4 older sisters, and we had just a lot of fun. When I was a baby, my parents bought a little cottage in Parry Sound, just east of Parry Sound, about 20 minutes, on a lake called Manitowobbing, which is beautiful when you look at the translation, from Indigenous into English. It actually just means, spirit and kind of great spirit. And I certainly, me and my sisters, developed, our love of nature in this area, just rock, water, trees everywhere, and just spent my childhood exploring nature and trying to figure out what these plants were and what all these insects were and these birds and these bird calls. And it just became this passion of mine. But I never really found a mentor, like through my whole young life. I didn't really have a person who I could go to for more information or resources or things like that. That didn't really happen, actually.
Your parents weren't into bugs or nature so much?
My dad was, but more from an aspect of fishing and hunting and things like that. But not like the whole kind of ecology and proper nomenclature of plants and the science behind the relationships. But so that just made me become like this self-studying, crazy intensity kind of person that was always trying to figure everything out. And that led to an education eventually pursuing a Bachelor of Science at the University of Guelph, but that's not where I started. I was actually streamlined by my high school counselor to pursue an arts degree. I always wanted to be a teacher. I have that in me. I have that archetype in me, which, a lot of us do, thankfully, in this industry. And so I sort of was put down that path, and it was just the wrong place for me to be in arts. And I switched over to the University of Guelph and kind of just kept going after that and kind of fell into a master's degree. I like research, but I'm not like a full-on long-term 5-year project researcher. That's not really me. I like to do different kinds of things. But I ended up doing a master's degree, which was a fantastic experience, and that's a wonderful school. And then I just got to know people through this whole kind of journey. And I always say when I give lectures at universities and colleges, it's about the relationships. Like, we are only as successful as we can be because of the relationships that we have. And we can say that personally for sure, but definitely professionally. And so I always made contacts. I was always making teams out of the groups that I was put into. And I think it also comes from being in a big family and being the youngest. It was just, I became the geller in just about every situation. And that led into working for OMAFRA, which is the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, which, my clients all knew.
Now I know what it is.
Now you know what it is. Yeah, so the provincial government, the Ministry of Agriculture, where I became, through a series of convoluted steps, I became the provincial nursery and landscape specialist. That was back in 1998. So I became the go-to person for people that were arborists such as yourself, horticulturalists, professional gardeners, landscapers, like anybody who had anything to do with either growing, producing, propagating trees, shrubs, perennials, or maintaining them, planting them through their whole kind of life cycle. So I was the go-to person for the whole value chain for what I called outdoor ornamentals, trees, shrubs, and perennials. And I did that for almost 24 years. And then in early 2022, it was just time for a change for me. And so I left that position and I joined my beautiful husband with his business. And now I work with Greenbird Horticultural, which is our business. And
Nice.
and also we have a tree service called Beautiful Trees, Inc.
Cool.
So that's us as well.
So is it a little bit different than when you were doing the OMAFRA, as opposed to now you're kind of more in like the service end of things, I guess? Is that what you'd say? Or was the work with OMAFRA kind of service end as well?
It's very different because for my whole career with OMAFRA, my customers were professional horticulturalists, arborists, landscapers. So now my customers are homeowners. So
Right.
I'm it's completely different, dealing and communicating with homeowners, as you know, compared to, colleagues in the industry. And I still kind of walk that line in the middle. I'm still a resource person for lots of people in the industry, and that's a beautiful thing. And I continue with all of those relationships. And I still leverage those professional relationships to help others, which is what I did in my whole career. It's one of my most favorite things to do. So.
Very cool. And then you're also into bugs and stuff too. Is that right?
Yeah.
You have something about, you're at a bug app here, and then Dwayne Newstater, owner of Arboriculture Canada, just kept telling me that you're the bug lady. And I'm like, I thought she was the fungi lady.
Yeah, I have to wear, being a provincial specialist, I had to wear so many different hats, and I had to be this kind of like generalist biologist, horticulturalist, arborist, and all the science behind it. So I had to know a moderate amount of information about a lot of different topics. And so I dove in on a case-by-case basis, and I used those amazing relationships that I had when I got stuck, which was quite often in this industry. There's hundreds of nursery plants, right? There's hundreds of nursery crops and ornamental plants, and there's literally hundreds of pest and abiotic problems that can be associated, and they present differently, and it's tricky. And so, through teaching workshops and lectures over the years, people started to say, Jen, is there like an app for what you do?
Yeah.
And I used to laugh at that. I'm like, I don't know how to build an app. And then I started talking to one of my colleagues, Dave Chung, and he said, well, actually, I have a friend who builds apps, and what if we took like some of the most common insect and mite pests for nursery and landscape, and so we built BugFinder. And this is a free app, and it's for iPhones as well as Android, and it's 82 species of the most common insect and mite pests.
Is it just to your area?
It's
generally?
Yeah, it's Eastern Canada, Northeastern United States. There's going to be definitely some overlap with Western Canada as well. But it's not just the pests, it's also some of the symptoms on the trees and plants themselves. And there's no other app out there that's really like it. And it's fun to get feedback from people. Like I've had people from Cornell University that contacted me and said, "Oh, great app, thanks for doing this."
Oh, really?
And,
yeah, they have that bird app. Is that?
They do.
Yeah, the Merlin bird ID. I love that. This last year we fell in love with that thing. Like, if anybody doesn't know, you can go on this app. Yeah, and you can just like record the sound of birds and it tells you what bird it is, even if there's multiple birds. And then you can save them, kind of like you're going out Pokemoning or something.
It's true.
Birding, I guess they call it. We called the bird one time from our front step, and like the bird just came flying right towards and flew right in the house because we had the door open, and we're like, oh my God. So we had to tap back on the bird app, like just to avoid birds flying into us because they come so fast. And then I was kind of getting worried that maybe, we don't know exactly what the language is, and I didn't want to be stressing them out because it's, some of them say they're alarm calls, but I'm like, does anyone really know if the other ones are not alarming to them or like asking for help or something? Because they seem to rush over more so than curiosity. So
what time of year was it that you did that?
Gosh, I can't know. I don't know, like June, I think, springish, but.
So breeding season. So when birds, they sing these beautiful songs, but it's not just for our entertainment. They're singing this song to say, if you can hear this song, you're in my territory and get out because this is my territory. So if you play us another territorial song, which a lot of songs are, those really beautiful bird songs, they're territorial calls. And so if you played another male's territorial call in that male's territory, he's going to come flying at him going,
We were playing Huberus mexicanus, the finch, forget what kind of finch, little pink one. It's really cute.
Okay.
We don't have a ton of biodiversity out here.
Okay.
I feel like we probably do. I just don't see it as much as other places. But we called that bird. But then a sparrow was the one that came over flying at us. So I was like, that's kind of weird because it was a different call. But maybe that's what you're saying there is kind of territorial. So
could have been.
I liked what you said earlier, how you fell into this kind of thing. Because I kind of found myself doing similar. Is that when you get into trees and you want to understand trees, first you want to be an arborist. You want to learn how to cut them down. Then you're like, okay, well, now I got to prune them. Then it's like, okay, well, how do I know when to prune and when to remove a tree? So then it becomes it lies on the arborist to kind of make that decision and be these advocates for trees. So then you have to understand how sick they really are, whether they can recover from it, whatever. And that led me, at least, into soil health and then fungi and how it connects, even though I'm not a mycologist. And then into, like learning about birds, because you find birds in trees and their nests, and you learn about their patterns, and then insects, and like you're an arborist, but you have to touch among these other things to kind of fully understand what it means to be an arborist and how trees work, because a tree is just not like a solitary thing that has no connection to anything else. It's connected to every other ecosystem. So cutting a tree down has impact on so many other things that I think are maybe unintended consequences when we remove a tree or even prune it, depending on how we're pruning it and that sort of thing. So I thought that was interesting, what you had mentioned there earlier about that.
So
is that how you got led down that path, like learning about all that other stuff, or did you just naturally get drawn to it?
I just get pulled into these vortexes of either, somebody's research or somebody's realizations, or perhaps even Indigenous teachings, and the things that really resonate with me, the things that really make me vibrate. Like it feels like on many different levels, not just this physical plane is the best way. And then I know that I got to take a deeper dive, and I need to look into this a little bit more. What a lot of people don't realize is just the intricate role that trees have with the microbiome. And the microbiome, we're just talking about microorganisms, which could be fungi, bacteria, and other, microorganisms. And they're intricately tied together. In fact, trees are actually full of microbes. They have hundreds, sometimes even thousands, of what are called endophytes. So those are just the fungi. There's also bacteria that live inside them, and they seem to have this relationship together, this community inside them. And it's when this relationship is in balance that the tree can be healthy, and it can be superior in growth and vitality and its tolerance to insect pests and diseases that come along. And it's just like us, right? We have our own microbial communities inside of us, in our respiratory system and our gastrointestinal system. And when these are in balance, and we eat good food and live foods and, prebiotics like sweet potatoes, they're feeding all the good guys, and we've got this balance. Trees are doing the same thing. And they also have those relationships with their root system. And it's, science has basically rationalized that about 500 million years ago, plants were these kind of unicellular organisms that really just lived in the water, and they evolved to be able to live on land in terrestrial systems because of fungi that form relationships with them to act as a temporary root system. So plants could go on and evolve to live in terrestrial systems. And now plants are the most dominant life form in terrestrial systems. And that's actually because of the fungal relationships that they have in their root systems. And they're called...
Oh, go ahead.
Then they're called mycorrhizal fungi for the most part.
There's just so much information here I want to unpack for people.
Yeah, okay. I get so excited.
No, me too. And I love this stuff and read into it a lot and everything. And I've already got questions for you. But you mentioned plants, how they started out kind of in water and then they moved to land. Is it correct to say that they started out as algae? I think I read this somewhere. And then the first plant organism on land was lichen. And is it lichen a kind of a combination between algae and fungi together? Mm-hmm. And that's the first sort of plant on land. Is that right?
In terms of like the whole sequence of the whole science of the whole ecology or evolution of plants, it's not my area of expertise. So I can't confirm to say yay or nay in this particular case. But it is, these just all of these relationships, it's these relationships that have advanced organisms to be, going from really simple organisms to much more complex organisms that can function and be more multicellular and be able to have more of a significant role in the ecology too.
Yeah, that's so cool. And then you got to mycorrhizal fungi, and I'm sure most arborists have heard about mycorrhizal fungi. I know when I first heard about it, it was like this mind-blowing thing, because you pay no attention to kind of what you don't see. It's just kind of, I think, general natural human behavior. If you don't see it, you don't believe it. Or homeowners see fungi growing in their mulch, excuse me, and think it's mold, and then rake it all out from under the tree. That white netting that you can see the little layers of. Mm-hmm. So I always think of like trees and having a healthy tree as being like the fruit of all of the labor that is done underground. It's like the result of a healthy ecosystem. And then the climax, because I think they are a climax species for a whole ecosystem, is a healthy tree. And we're sort of, going about it not the wrong way, but in a more challenging way by taking a climax species type plant and sticking in a very rudimentary, soil system in an urban environment and then expecting it to grow without much love and care. But somehow they're so resilient, they can survive a lot of these situations. Maybe it's with your climate, your zone is a little bit more lenient. I know where I'm from, it's very dry. It's like the foothills, and we have a lot of Chinooks. So in the winter, things thaw out and it gets to be plus 10 Celsius, and then then back to cold snap, and the trees get confused. So they grow kind of stunted and they get sick easily. And if you plant an ornamental, it's like, good luck unless you actually care for it. So, mycorrhizal fungi, can you explain what mycorrhizal fungi is and kind of how that interacts with the tree symbiotically?
Yeah, so there's essentially it's a fungus that forms an association with the root system, and it just depends on the type of mycorrhizal fungus. But what they're doing is they're coming into this intimate relationship because the fungus cannot photosynthesize. It can't make its own carbon. So
Right.
it needs the plant for a carbon source. And the fungus can form this huge network underground around the system and attached to the root system. So it's getting carbon, but what it's doing is going out into the soil and absorbing and storing so that it can shunt this into the plant roots, water, some mineral nutrients. Phosphorus is a big one that mycorrhizal fungi can actually bring back to the plant. So they have this two-way relationship. So, and the root system of the plant compared to this root system with this mycorrhizal fungal add-on can be like anywhere from 10 to 100 or more times. So
Right.
a plant just with a mycorrhizal fungal partner in its root system can just have access to so many more resources. And then the other thing that they've discovered, and actually it was Suzanne Simard from University of British Columbia, is not only are they just exchanging, but the mycorrhizal fungal network actually networks trees, one tree to another tree. And so she's called it the term, like one of the bigger trees in the forest system, the mother tree. And the mother tree can actually be a source of carbon for other younger trees that are in the network. And she can send her carbon even preferentially to her own offspring in the forest. And nurture and help them along. She'll send carbon to other trees as well, but she's been able to show that they preferentially can send a bit more carbon to their own offspring. And then they exchange chemical signals. Like if the mother tree gets attacked by, let's say, LDD moth, which was the moth formerly known as gypsy moth or spongy moth, they're called now, she can actually send little chemical signals through that fungal network to warn other plants, okay, time to beef up your secondary metabolites and any kind of toxins that you might have, getting those going up in the leaves so that, any insect that comes along is not going to be as so delicious. So here's an early warning system. And there's all kinds of communication that goes on there as well. So it's not just about resources, it's also signaling. It's this huge network that's under our feet that we can't see, we can't really perceive until we start kicking up humus and detritus in the soil and we see this white fuzzy network of mycelium, which is the vegetative stage, right? Of the growth.
That's so amazing how they're all connected there. And as most of us probably think as arborists, mushrooms, are a sign of decay or bad. So we're like, no, scary tree, like it's getting eaten alive and whatever.
And they can be, absolutely.
Yeah, there's so many different types of fungi out there, but they're not all, and let's all remember here, like negative versus positive, that's just labels that we as humans put on things, right? Because we're looking at a tree in someone's front yard as the primary point of attention here that we want to preserve or want to grow for aesthetic or emotional reasons, whatever it might be. So we then demonize everything else, like the bugs that are on the tree and then the mushrooms growing around the bottom of the tree. We think it's decaying, whatever, but that's just nature like doing its thing. Like you mentioned before, everything exists in balance. And if there's something out of balance, nature's going to generally try and take care of that. And maybe you have a new abundance of a certain type of mycelium that's going to take over, or it's going to decompose something to feed something else, which eventually will be the food for that tree to ultimately make it healthier again. So it's just a cool thought process that I try and remind myself and other arborists too, that there's a lot more going on than meets the eye. And we don't always need to be so quick to intervene on a lot of these trees when homeowners and things like that are asking for our help. And just to add to that, I had this kind of thought or insight the other day about trees and our responsibility being advocates for them. But as arborists or horticulturists, whatever we might be, like we're the first, I wouldn't say like line of defense, but we're the first ones to come and show up and we're like the last ones, right? It's not like we're going there looking at the tree and then we're like, okay, well, we'll hand it off to the other tree person now, and then they'll come in and they'll decide whether they need to remove it or not. Like, it's usually like the same person from start to finish. So if you don't like speak up or offer other recommendations or do something, then you're not being the greatest advocate for those trees, in my opinion. And oftentimes they end up in removal if they're not looking that good, or people think they're sick when they're not as sick as they actually are, that sort of thing. So I just like people to keep that in mind, maybe as we're chatting, and how this stuff all kind of connects, so we can find maybe some alternate solutions. You mentioned the fungi there in the forests, and I'm also curious, that duff layer or layer of organic matter that falls in these forests where the fungi exist, like how deep does that go generally, and is it feeding on the organic matter around there, or the minerals and rock, and how does that kind of work?
So it really depends. It depends on the forest. It depends on the environment. Here in southern Ontario, that duff layer in our forests, we really only, it really only becomes something that's actually of any decent thickness is when we get up into the areas of Muskoka, Parry Sound, what we call cottage country for us.
Right.
We're actually located just north of the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area, but in these southern climes, there's so much worm activity, and worms, apparently they weren't here before the Ice Age, so there's something that have migrated through continental drift is the theory. So a lot of the worm species here are not exactly, I suppose, native, but that's to even define that. But anyways, so when we ever get these kind of non-native organisms into a new habitat, they sort of go a little bit crazy. So worms are amazing because of the function that they play in the ecology. But there's so many worms here in southern Ontario that the leaf litter that drops to the ground is basically consumed by decomposers such as worms very quickly. And so there's very little duff layer, leaf litter on our forest floors here in, the Golden Horseshoe area. I would say anywhere, Barrie and below. So because of that, and because things have changed, and it is, climate change, and it is warmer, and we're getting milder winters and all of those things, there's less insulation on the forest floor for the trees, which puts another layer of stress on the trees as well, meaning that they're not insulated against extreme temperatures as much, and also moisture conditions. We don't have that duff layer on our forest floors and the deeper part of southern Ontario to help insulate against, really hot, dry conditions as well. So it's quite a significant factor. And
You think that's a change that's just been happening?
Yes.
Or is it just so you're thinking like a climate change type thing, like temperatures warming, and then duff layers drying out, blowing away, that kind of thing, like just reducing in general compared to what they should be?
And it's been happening over decades. It's not just something that has just happened, but it's something that we've been noticing over the last several decades. So that's another change and another stressor in the southern Ontario forest and forested areas and more natural landscapes. Yeah. Right.
So that relates to mulching in the urban environment when we're looking after trees. And you mentioned it already, and of course, correct me where I'm wrong, where you see things, but this duff layer, like trees, or maybe we should go through kind of the life cycle of a tree, of how they would prefer to grow in a sort of a perfect environment. Probably coming from either like a rhizome, like a root shooting back up like grass would, or like poplar trees out here, which is kind of like a clone of an existing tree. So sometimes a forest here could be all one organism. Likely there's a few different trees that originated, but I don't know. Or they can come from a seed, and then seeds, of course, have genetic variability in them. So no two seeds or the genetics of those trees or whatever might grow are the same. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes.
So these seeds fall however they might fall from these trees, probably within a forest already, where they're going to be a little bit sheltered from wind and that sort of thing, fall down in a duff layer, get covered. Hopefully there's moisture already retained, as you mentioned, in these duff layers. If they're thick enough, they should be able to hold moisture, provide shade, that sort of thing, and then the seed will kind of grow. Could you take us kind of through how that life cycle would normally be, just in a basic level, as far as what a tree should kind of go through?
Sure. And, we see those occasions in nature, trees, like other plant organisms, they can be more successful when their seeds are carried away from them and can be dispersed, right? So wind dispersal is a big one. There's a lot of tree species that use that mechanism. And then a lot of them will also use like a fleshy fruit or seed. That would be interesting for wildlife, and they'll disperse them. So that's a really important mechanism, is that dispersal. And then if a seed does germinate, grows as a seedling in the forest, most of the species that grow in our forests, they're shade tolerant as juvenile trees, but then they get to a certain point and they need an opening in the canopy in order to really kind of complete their life cycle and thrive. Being in that deep shade, sugar maples are a great example of that. They can be very, very shade tolerant. We see forests that are, full of saplings, but it's really, they're waiting for an opening in the canopy, whether it's storm damage or a tree succumbs to something, or perhaps old age. So there's always this sort of genetic and, like you said, diverse bank of seedlings in the forest that's always kind of ready to go. And so, our job, like as forest walkers, forest lovers, is we can help disperse seeds. There's a lot of people that, ash and emerald ash borer, which has attacked our ash trees. There's a lot of people just in North America that will go out and collect ash seeds and actually disperse them through areas and edges of forests and places like that to try to increase the chances that there will still be a seedling bank for them.
Oh, okay. And through evolution, essentially, hopefully some of those trees are naturally resistant to the pest that's out there, and then those will be allowed to grow and then reseed and have genetic similarities to their mother tree, and eventually get out of the problem with the balance of the pests. Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, and we have seen that. When I first started in my career, we had a pest called pine shoot beetle, Tomicus pinniperta, which is a little boring beetle that would bore under the bark, lay its eggs, and then the larvae would feed, in that really sensitive phloem and like sapwood kind of tissue and destroy it in the process. And so the trees would flag and fail. And that was, 26 years ago. And pine shoot beetle has not taken over our plantations. Like, it seems to have kind of staved off. I'm not sure exactly why, or it was a whole bunch of different things together. But, from its first introduction into Canada to it finding some balance, like, I think it holds the record probably for coming into balance that quickly. But even just, with emerald ash borer, there's waves of emerald ash borer. So they'll come through a whole area, move geographically across it, and try to, that's just their mechanism of survival. Yeah. They're just feeding on host material. But then when a lot of the hosts, die back, there's a very low, negligent population of emerald ash borer. So by having potentially having more seedlings coming up, it's like you say, hopefully there's some tolerance in some of them, but hopefully, the emerald ash borer has kind of moved on. And as long as it's not reintroduced into the area, hopefully we can have this gene bank for this species.
I got a side question here for you too about that. I just noticed in my own observations out pruning trees that, some years it's like there's aphids on, certain species or most trees that I'm working on. Like they're there maybe at certain times of year, maybe they're there all year. And I can assume it's weather conditions, all sorts of different things. But it's like, but generally if I break it down to a simplistic way, it's like one year, it's like aphids everywhere. The next year, it's like there's like budworm outbreak, or I don't know, but it's always like something different. There's always like something in excess. But, I generally tell people just through intuition and everything, that's just like insects cycle like anything else. Maybe they're coming to correct the balance and then they're moving on or whatever, but like what's going on there? How come you don't see that same problem like every single year? Like even in an urban environment, are they flying away to a different region, or is it like what happens?
I have also noticed the same cycling thing, well, about lots of insects, but about aphids in particular. And I was always very curious about that as well. And through my own work and my own observation, because I did so much scouting and monitoring, both for the landscape and also the nursery production sector too, is what I noticed, Kurt, is that in springs where we had really cool weather during leaf emergence in the spring, like unusually, so that the plants were almost like they're emerging, but they were coming out in like suspended animation. And then that's when the aphids, either they overwinter or they potentially hatch as eggs or what have you. But they can thrive in those conditions because as the new foliage is emerging in the spring, that it's really, really soft and supple. You know how soft and lovely new foliage is when it comes out. It doesn't have that thick, waxy cuticle on it yet. It hasn't fully expanded yet. It hasn't hardened off. And the hardening off is the development of that waxy cuticle. And that waxy cuticle makes it really hard for an insect with a little tiny, piercing, sucking mouth parts or penetrating, which is almost like a really like nano needle kind of situation.
Because people don't know, aphids want to feed on the plant, the sap in the leaves. That's why they're usually probably on the underside because it's less thick, less protective, like you're talking about.
And the youngest parts, you would always find aphids feeding on the youngest part of leaves, so always the newest leaves that are just coming out.
Gotcha.
Because they can penetrate and get their food so easily. So when these plants in these cooler springs are in this suspended animation and they're emerging, but there's not quite enough heat for them to fully expand and harden off, the aphids are just like, cool, we're going to get in here, we're going to party, come on over here, this is a great spot. And they'll feed and then they start reproducing. And most aphid species can reproduce without actually having to copulate, without needing the female or the male and female. They can reproduce. It's called parthenogenetically. And so they can actually just make clones of themselves inside their own bodies and then kind of poop them out. And they've got all those babies, and they can do that in a very fast cycle. So the aphid populations during those cool springs really build. And then by the time the warm weather gets, there's just a much bigger aphid population than would normally be, and it's because that's what I've noticed in my work.
So you think it's the unique climate qualities of that year then? Like if we have a solid year here where maybe we get some standard snow, moisture, whatever, it all melts really fast, things wake up and it stays consistent on that upward trend. It would be different from a year where we have this back and forth snow, moisture, then back to cold, warm up a little bit again, back to cold.
During leaf emergence, that's the key.
Which is, the spring, and when everything's lagging, especially here.
And the second leaf emergence, because a lot of trees and shrubs, they'll push out, 2 periods of growth where they'll leaf out a second time, and some will even do a third. And so any cool weather during those leaf emergence periods, aphids can really take advantage of that and reproduce quickly.
Gotcha. And I think a lot of aphids here, and maybe other bugs too, correct me if I'm wrong, but can see like an infrared. They can see a different light spectrum. So
and UV.
People, and UV, like that's nuts. It's imagine being able to see more than what we can see. Like we think whatever we see is it, but there's more light spectrums because all we're seeing is really the light reflecting off of physical objects in our eyes, and then we make sense of it with our brain. But an aphid can go whipping by and be like, oh, 2 trees that look identical on 2 houses in their front yard, same species, whatever, and they'll annihilate one tree but not the other. But apparently in infrared or UV, whatever, that tree appears weak and it's not as nutrient dense as the other one. So essentially it's sick or weak, so then it becomes a target. And that's why they would choose one tree over another. Is that right?
It is, and the trees are also giving off chemical signals of stress as well that the insects
Okay.
can pick up through their antennae. And so
Wow.
those, yeah, so
What kind
they're
of
also
signals?
they're just called like semiochemicals. So they're just you know, the trees are just producing these chemicals under stress, and the insects can sense them and know that that is a tree that's weak, so it's not going to have as much energy putting into, say, secondary metabolites, maybe not as thick of a waxy cuticle, maybe not as much calcium on their cell wall to protect them, and so they know that they're an easier target for them to colonize and feed on.
So do you think in a natural environment, objectively speaking, these trees that are putting out these what do you call it, sensio-chemicals?
Semiochemicals.
Semiochemicals.
Yeah.
Do you think they're doing that because they know that they don't have eyes, but they're supposed to be growing in a forest as part of a whole, as part of these greater ecosystems? Like, does a tree essentially say, I'm sick, I'm not doing good, I'm throwing in the towel? Them other trees like, okay, we're going to cut off some of your supply now and give it to the trees that are growing better because maybe they have better genetic variability for the long-term sustainability of our forest. But you need to feed the aphids as well, so you're going to put off this chemical and attract it, maybe even deferring the bugs or the pests from other healthier trees, but essentially sacrificing themselves in the forest. Because why would they put off a chemical is what I'm wondering, to attract a pest that's going to take them down, unless it's like doing it on purpose.
I don't know if they are. I mean, I don't know.
I mean, they're not conscious like we think they are, but
we're trying to lay our, humanistic thought processes on a biological organism that is in a completely different kingdom to us too, right? So I don't know the answers to that. I think that there's probably people out there, ecologists that are studying that. But I mean, it's like, when I'm under stress, I'm also giving off chemical signals that I'm under stress that you probably are picking up from me on an unconscious level if we were in the same room, probably even better. And you don't even realize that you're doing it, but your brain is telling you, okay, Jen's not doing well today. We're not going to be able to complete this project today, or whatever it is that we're working on. I think that all organisms probably communicate in all kinds of different languages. There's nonverbal cues. There's these chemicals and pheromones that we give off too. And I think we're just talking to each other. And I know that trees that are sick, I do believe in the research that they've also shown that trees will send carbon to ailing trees as well.
Share it and try and help it out.
To help them out, and young trees for sure. So like those trees, those seedlings that are trying to be that reserve forest in the understory, waiting for the canopy to open up for their chance to grow, they're definitely being fed by the other trees in terms of the carbon and some of the resources that they need.
Yeah, it's really cool because it kind of reminds me that we don't have to go very far, quote, below the surface to scratch down deep into this stuff before we reach a point where it's kind of like, I don't know, we can't explain it. There's so much interconnected intricacies, connection between all this stuff that we can't explain, and it's probably going to be like that for a very long time. So I try to rely on these natural systems, and I like to mimic nature as much as possible. And I can't always go as deep and explain exactly why, but it feels right. And it's like putting native species mulch under a tree that comes from a variety of species in that area, buds, bark, sapwood, heartwood, some decaying, some not, like, whatever it might be, under a tree seems to make more sense to me than putting down a bunch of imported cedar mulch, or using a rubber mulch, obviously, that kind of thing, because there's reasons why that exists normally in nature, and try to mimic it as best as possible. Would you say?
Yes, definitely. I mean, cedar mulch is a fantastic mulch, and we use it as a weed barrier and a barrier to retain moisture. It's a wonderful tool. But it also has antifungal properties, so it's not going to break down as quickly. And that's why we use it in some garden situations. So because of that, but by using, like aspen, poplar, maple, birch, and those kind of, woods that can break down a little bit more quickly, they can be a faster source of organic nutrients like you were talking about. Fungi are the decomposers and recyclers of the whole ecosystem. We couldn't survive without them. The plants couldn't survive without them. As I like to say, we'd still be tripping over dinosaur carcasses if it wasn't for fungi. But they really do break everything down so it can be reused as a nutrient source again. And it's an important part of the system. So it's like what we're saying, like like you're saying, it's not just the tree, right?
Yeah.
It's the whole ecosystem, but it's not just the plants either. It's this whole kingdom of microorganisms, and it's not just the fungi. There's also bacteria and other microbes in there together. So we know that the microbes need the trees, they need their carbon. We know that the trees need the microbes as that adjunct root system, and over 90% of the terrestrial plants that we have a mycorrhizal fungal partner, which is amazing. Like it really, adds kind of scientific proof to that evolutionary theory that we were talking about, how they evolved to go from water to land systems. So we need to feed kind of all of that. So what makes a lot of sense is by having as many plants, as diverse as possible, growing with active root systems for growing for as many months of the year as possible in a yard, in a property situation, and also using mulches and different kinds of mulches, maybe not just cedar mulch, using organics, introducing mycorrhizal fungi, introducing things like compost tea, and also introducing even carbohydrate sources into the soil system to signal to those organisms, okay, there's food here, come on and germinate. Because a lot of mycorrhizal fungi, they just exist. I mean, where we don't find them is like the sides of the highways, or other like commercially like soils that they brought into, streets that are, completely uniform and have been mixed a million times. Those soils are dead. There's not a lot of beneficial organisms. And it's in those situations where the introduction of mycorrhizal fungi is so pivotal and can make a huge difference. But they still need food, and they eat carbon. And our soils are starving of carbon. We've got carbon leaving our soils at alarming rates. And the answer is having more plants growing, because, like we talked about at the conference, plants are harvesting carbon from the air. They're making it into, these sugars and starches, and they push something like anywhere from 20 to 50% of that carbon out their root system into the soil. So they're feeding the microbiome. They're connecting these whole kind of systems together in this big circular loop.
Right.
And
the
we
soil
can help.
food web we sometimes referred, or that's the term coined by Dr. Elaine Ingham. If anyone that's interested and wants to go dive a little deeper into kind of the soil and its whole ecosystem, you can look her up on YouTube and wherever else. Some podcasts and stuff like that has some great information. That's what I did. And I tied together like permaculture and arboriculture, and they had to fill in all these gaps with this soil science stuff. But I mean, it only took a few podcasts, honestly, to kind of really understand what was going on. And then all these light bulbs went off of like, oh, and then I could just kind of come up with my own solutions. So that's why I love talking about plant health and soil and the fungi, and not only because it's cool and interesting, but once you understand the basics of kind of how this all works, then okay, when I put a spray on a tree that's going to kill these bugs above the surface and it all drips down to the soil, it's kind of non-selective, and it's going to go in there and it's going to wipe out a whole ton of biodiverse organisms in the soil, right? And then if we know that the microorganisms in the soil are not only responsible for eating these carbohydrates the plants create and then creating waste, and that waste becomes food for the tree and whatever, but the microorganisms are also tunneling through at different sizes, and they're creating that pore space. and the pore space is part of the way oxygen can get into the soil and feed roots, which I didn't know that roots need oxygen. And I'm like, well, that doesn't make sense because the oxygen's up in the air and it's not in the soil. But so you need that pore space for the oxygen to get down there. You need water to be able to infiltrate and actually drain instead of just like wipe off the surface and go downhill. You know, like there's so many moving parts going on. And again, it's like you don't have to understand every little detail, but if you can mimic nature, again, these processes will just kind of carry out for you. So, I mean, I tell people to think about when they ask a question when I'm gone, I'm like, try and incorporate an answer that includes something that's organic, something that's diverse, like some sort of diversity into your answer. There's one other thing too. Man, I've already forgot, but basically mimic nature and find something there. So, man, Kate, you've brought up a lot of questions I had when you were going on and talking about some of those systems. How does carbon kind of get held in the soil? Because you mentioned carbon comes out of the soil a lot, or we're losing a lot of it. And this is a big part with global climate changes and that sort of thing from, you know, whatever it is, a lot of agriculture and deforestation and things. You know, we don't have as big of an impact as being arborists, but forests in general, they're sequestering carbon through photosynthesis or in the atmosphere. And they're excreting, like you said, up to maybe 40% of it through their root systems and putting on wood en masse, which is all carbon essentially as well, right? So they're storing it into some sort of physical form. But when they excrete it into the ground, like what's the process there? Like how's it staying in the ground? Is it like pockets of gas, or is it just more topsoil being created, like all of the above?
It becomes food, and then it becomes part of the body of another organism.
Okay.
Right? So the mycorrhizal fungal network that we discussed, you know, where they're, you know, in like a meter of root, there can be something like a whole kilometer worth of mycelium, which are the vegetative fungal hyphae of the fungal organism that's associated with that root. So there is a lot of biomass in the fungal network that's in the soil that, again, is this network that's linking all these plants together. And so they're actually a huge sink for carbon. And then we talked about the root systems, the actual root systems themselves, and of course the above ground parts of the plant as well. But any other plant form in that soil, which is also the organic matter. And organic matter, you know, is this older kind of like dead plants, dead organisms, and it's just sort of being held there as this organic residue. And in soil, when we do soil analysis, we like to see organic matter that's hopefully higher than 4 or 5%, which you can see in garden situations, but like in a nursery field situation, we're usually below that unless they've been doing
Below
cover
5?
cropping. Yeah, they can be, depending
And I
if
know,
they at the end of a
Horticultural
cycle of a plant. But you know, peat moss, peat bogs, huge carbon sink.
I've heard that.
Huge carbon sink. And it's really interesting. They're, you know, the boreal forest at the top of the globe, at the top of the world. They say that the boreal forest right now makes up about 30% of the forested area of the earth. And scientists are saying that it is a major sink of carbon because of the wetlands and the peat bogs that are locked in this frozen space, you know, for most of the year.
Just holding it.
And that those forests actually hold much more carbon than tropical forests. So every time the soil warms up, every time we expose the soil to air and heat in these temperatures, that carbon source, that carbon storage, it burns up, it burns off, it's lost back to the air. And so every time we cultivate and we turn over a garden, that carbon source and those microbes start to die as they're exposed to the air. So the best thing we can do is when we do that is that we plant the soil really quickly as possible, and then we put either a cover crop in there or we mulch with something, which, you know, a lot of gardeners will use straw or any other kind of mulch. Straw is great because it doesn't break down quickly, so it doesn't pull the nitrogen out of the soil as it's breaking down. But bare soil is just
the worst.
It really is. It's going to kill the microbiome in that soil very, very quickly. And so, you're going to see people using more perennial plants instead of annuals, less cultivation, less turning over of the garden. Just like anytime there's a soil disturbance or a root disturbance in the root zone of a tree, which can extend well beyond the canopy drip zone, drip line, that is also damaging for not only the root system, but the microbiome and the network that it used to be attached to. So it's just cutting off some of its network. So leaving soils as undisturbed as possible, mulching, having as many plants growing, which doesn't have to all be trees. It can be, there's all kinds of incredible ground covers that we can use as well, right. and small shrubs and perennials and incredible plants that all of these things, when we have, a yard or a property that there's actively growing plants that are bringing carbon back into the soil, and the microbiome is really starting to flourish, and that just feeds all of the plants, and it's this whole circle together. We have to think about, just like you said, like the whole kind of plant microbiome system altogether, and the animals and the insects.
Right, and if we can take care of the soil and build a nice, healthy soil, there's a myriad of benefits from that. But a healthy tree or plant, whatever it might be, is kind of like the end result of that. Mm-hmm. So it's almost like we should build soil, build that biodiversity, retain that moisture, get that all prepared, create that forest floor environment, essentially. And then, if you're lucky, you'll have a nice healthy tree or trees. I like to get away from thinking that we should only be planting one tree in the front yard of our houses, like you see so commonly, or in a boulevard where it's one single tree, go down 15 feet, one single tree. Mm-hmm. There's just no connection there. So I hope people are listening to this and thinking, okay, I can sort of see the problem now with some of the urban planting that we're doing, or maybe ways that we can improve upon it. Because I don't think, overnight we're going to change the way we're planting trees. And I think planting trees and these plants or whatever it might be in general is great. Whatever we can do, hopefully they can reproduce or sustain and survive and hopefully thrive. But there's a lot we can do. Simple things, I think, that will improve the health of these trees, and ultimately that'll improve the biodiversity of a whole bunch of different ecosystems as well. So getting back to that, you were talking about some diversity and some different things, and we were kind of originally starting to talk about how a tree naturally grows in the forest and its kind of life cycle. We can tie in some actionable things now maybe for arborists of what they can do when they're bringing a tree into someone's yard, or maybe showing up and the people have a sick tree, and they find a tree solitary by itself in the front yard, grass growing around it, maybe some edging, maybe a little landscape fabric and some rock and some weeds poking through. Mm-hmm. The ground looks hard, hasn't rained in a while. Mm-hmm. The people, maybe they irrigate, but they're irrigating like they do for their grass, so heavy, or maybe not heavy, but like more frequent short irrigations. Mm-hmm. They spray their lawn for some weeds, that kind of thing. This is, I think, a common narrative that we all hear. Mm-hmm. What are some things you think we could do as arborists to kind of change this paradigm, or some actual prescriptions that we could do?
So great question. And this is where, my experience over the last 23, 24 years really comes in. So the first place I like to start is right with the most important and basic thing that everybody needs to know, that if you don't hear anything else in this podcast right now, that you just take this home. This is the biggest one.
I can't wait.
I know, it's so exciting. We're built up.
Get your pen out.
Yeah, get your pen out. So trees, and you were talking about, the roots need to breathe. The bark also needs to breathe. And trees, when you go out in the forest, you're going to see trees when they come out of the ground, they come out of the ground in this kind of flare. There's this flare, there's these bigger roots, usually buttress roots. Sometimes they can look a little bit knuckly, but the tree does not go straight into the ground.
Yeah,
There
like a
is
power
a
pole.
root flare, exactly. Telephone poles are not alive.
Telephone
if it
pole,
looks like a
bad.
telephone pole, it's very bad. So there should be a flare and a root system that is at least partially above the soil. And that is a major site of gas exchange. And when we cover it up with mulch, or we cover it up with soil, or what have you, or landscape fabric, we actually prevent the gas exchange. And if it can't get rid of, say, carbon dioxide or anything else that it needs to get rid of, it builds up. It kills the tissue under the bark, which is the major regenerative jewel part of the tree that it needs to be alive, because that's where the meristem
Are we
is.
talking the cambium?
Yeah, the cambium, the phloem, the xylem, that's where it all is. So if that tissue dies, that means that water nutrients cannot move up and down past that point anymore. So the top can't talk to the bottom and vice versa, which is very deadly. So what happens is the tree will die back on that section, and then on the other sections, and usually we see trees dead within 3 to 5 years in that kind of situation. It sometimes can be longer, but just depends. So the root flare should be out of the soil. There should
Exposed.
be no mulch, no soil, and there should always be a flare. So whether it's your tree and it's been in the ground for years, or you're planting a tree, because it comes from a nursery. See, when in nursery production, they're cultivating. They'll use some, herbicides, but they're cultivating as a manual way of getting rid of competing weeds. And so when you get a tree, especially if it's come from field production, soil, whether it's in a big ball or a ball in burlap or a wire basket, it is your job as a horticulturalist, as an arborist, to clean off the top of that so that you expose that root flare. Because it's a lot of times it's covered up because of the cultivation that's happened in the nursery. So that if you do that one thing is going to save thousands of trees. So root flare should be exposed, no soil. And that means that the tree needs to be planted at the proper height to allow for the top of the root flare to be exposed. And so the other thing that happens is trees get planted too deep, or sometimes there's like a little, people are like, I think it, they think it looks better, or maybe, this weeping carigana, I've actually had a neighbor do this once years ago. I just thought it was too tall for the spot. So I planted it like a foot deeper, and now it's at the right height because it matches my front porch railing. And I'm like, because I came by, I'm like, what happened to that? So I'm like, oh my goodness. Oh, so I had to resurrect it, get it out of there. So that's a really important thing. So when we see mulch that's piled up against the stem of the tree,
The mulch volcano.
it's so lethal.
And people, meanwhile, they put more mulch on the bottom of the tree and then keep adding, but then it's like it's near the edges, or the edges of their little spot under the tree, so then it gets pushed towards the middle constantly and just builds up, and then, of course, shade, and then moisture, all these things that are good for decomposition, like we talked about, and then that smothering of some of that gas exchange, and then these microbes get in there and are starting to decompose, right? And they're decomposing and kind of going after the trunk and like passively choking it. Yeah. And we all know that cambium layer, that green layer, is just under the bark, especially on younger trees. And some of them have sensitive, very thin bark. You could use your fingernail to kind of pick it back. And if we interrupt that, we're interrupting that whole circulation, as you said. It's like cutting off the circulation to part of your arm. So obviously we don't want weed whackers, hitting it with mowers, anything like that. So I always encourage people to put some sort of edging in as well. Not only for the benefit to store the mulch and maybe plant some other things around there, but just to stop the tree from getting damaged. So it makes sense out in municipal areas where they're planted and plunked along the roads, just in grass, and they have this constant maintenance going on to keep that grass down. It's like trees are getting hammered out there.
They are,
and they can be too deep, like you said.
They can be too deep. There's actually, they're called root collar or root flare excavations, and There's a lot of arborists here in Ontario that are busy. Actually, they'll use an air spade, so an air, like pressurized air device, to blow the soil off of the tops of root collars or root flares, and it's actually like a full-time job for a lot of people here.
And then you can find girdling roots and other issues as well. So,
but and you mentioned that landscape fabric, which we still find in gardens, that people, you know, they'll have these big trees, they'll put landscape fabric, and then they'll plant, say, shrubs into the landscape fabric, and then they'll say to the homeowner, okay, we're going to throw some mulch on top of this, and you will not have any weeds, which is a kind of a big fat lie, because the weeds grow on top of it with the decomposing mulch.
Yeah.
But that landscape fabric limits gas exchange into the soil, moisture as well, drainage. It impacts it very negatively. So the microbes in the soil, they're not in this beautiful soil anymore. They're in this really wet soil that's really low in oxygen, and that's a different group of microbes that grow in those conditions.
We're talking anaerobic now, right?
Yeah, they're not supporting the plants anymore. They're not the fungi that the plants need to grow. So that landscape fabric should never be anywhere near the base of a tree, because we actually have a client right now. They have a huge amount of red pines that border the property. It's a beautiful estate property. A number of them are failing, and they're being girdled and choked by the landscape fabric around the base of the tree, around the root flare. And it's irreparable. So they're going to have to take some of these massive trees down, which is really sad to see. So we're not big advocates of the landscape fabric, period.
No, I'm not either. So sometimes it's interesting because you're, arborist, but landscape person too, and in that sort of space. And I know there's lots of landscapers out there that promote landscape fabric, or that's what they've been shown in school and whatever. I don't like it at all. Again, it goes back to what's natural, diverse, or organic. And I'm like, so people are like, should I put landscape fabric under my tree? Well, is that natural? No, right? What would be natural in a forest where a tree grows? That mulch layer and biodiversity and the natural composting that's going on. And people will argue, well, landscape fabric, I got this one that's permeable. And it's like, yeah, well, if you hold it under a pressurized water source like a tap, the water's going to go through the tiny holes. But as soon as you put it in the ground, it's clogged up with dust and dirt and covered up and whatever. And you don't need much of a difference in the soil horizon layers before water starts to act differently as well. So getting back to the cultivating you were talking about, where people are pulling out weeds at these nurseries, or in agriculture, or in garden beds when people want to pull stuff back and freshen it up. There's this layer where they hit a certain depth, and it's usually consistent across that board. Like if you were tilling, you're only getting down so far all the way across. And then when you have a difference in consistencies in the soil on top versus the bottom, you develop this hard pan layer, right? And then so moisture goes down, and whether it's landscape fabric now, or you've just fluffed the top and left the bottom, moisture can travel down, hit that layer, creates like this artificial kind of water table, and then shuttles off underground sideways and doesn't infiltrate again. So it's like another problem with landscape fabric, the water can't get through. So I recommend to people do like vertical tillage if they have to open stuff up or remedy the ground. Like maybe you do as well, or you have some other alternatives, but take like some sort of pitchfork type tool or whatever, and like be poking holes down vertically, and maybe move it back and forth a little bit to kind of create some natural cracking in the soil to bring oxygen, but also allow new organic matter and compost and teas and things like that to kind of infiltrate and increase the surface area. Do you recommend that at all? Like if you were to say to pull off this landscape, someone's listening and they rip off the landscape fabric and they're like, oh shit, it smells bad, it's hard, it's compact.
It's anaerobic, like you said.
Anaerobic, yeah.
Yep. So we use a couple of tools. We have a probe that we push into the ground that we would use for what we call deep root fertilizer. But we also, so it basically can forcefully pressurize a liquid suspension, and when it goes into the ground, it forcefully pushes this liquid out into the soil. And by doing that, it kind of opens the soil up to these air and water drainage channels like you're talking about. So we find it a lot more effective and just a lot more beneficial than just sticking in like a pitchfork. Because the pitchfork, although it's creating a channel, it's compacting the soil around it as it goes, right? So even if roots try to grow through it, they're going to hit that layer of compaction and
if you're
glazing.
wiggling it back and forth, because it's like an immediate compaction right around it.
You got this immediate compaction. So with ours, it goes into the soil, the probe, and then it shoots out water suspension. So in that suspension, you can have your fertilizer. For us, we have a really low phosphorus fertilizer that we use that we've added more things like calcium, magnesium, chelated iron, manganese, and things like that are more available, that's in tune with our soils that we're using, that we're growing on here in Southern Ontario. Because I got to see all the soil reports, right, for those 24 years. So I know our Ontario soils. We were able to work with our supplier and actually customize our fertilizer. And I'm happy to talk to anybody about that. But we can also use water-soluble organics, water-soluble carbon sources, like any kind of water-soluble, or
to put down there.
We've actually used just water, because we're going in with the intention of increasing the drainage and the air pore space and water pore space of the soil, because it's very compacted. And it's a beautiful system. It's really effective. And then we also will use an air spade, where we'll make these kind of like these vertical columns in the soil at a density that we prescribe based on how compacted the soil is and what's in the landscape. So we'll air spade out these columns, and then when we put the soil back in, the original parent soil, we'll add organics, we'll add compost, we'll add usually some wood fiber or some mulch, or partially composted mulch, and maybe even some beneficial, like deficient nutrients, like some, again, like chelated iron or manganese if there's a deficiency going on. Magnesium, which is, a really big macronutrient, and it's kind of like, it's a big part of the chlorophyll molecule, magnesium. A lot of people don't know that. Calcium. So you can add, and what you're doing is you're creating these pockets of just amazing, wonderful places for roots to grow. So in the year or two following this vertical mulching with the air spade, the root systems will grow into these pockets, and the tree will kind of rejuvenate, and it'll put on more canopy. It'll be more tolerant of disease and insects, and you'll see it quite notably. So these are some of the things that they're doing, especially around heavily trafficked areas, parks, and things like that in urban areas, and they can see, huge improvements.
It's really cool.
Yeah.
Would you say, that thought process and that sort of method is usually because you're coming from a perspective of you're trying to repair an unbalanced, deteriorated type soil environment. So you're needing to come in and create some interventions and hopefully try and replace some of these nutrients or minerals, whatever it might be, immediately, so the tree can get something right away.
To get going, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But I guess in general, just so people understand, like if the tree was in its natural environment, like a forest again, or some of these things were done properly, maybe right from the beginning when you planted a tree, if it was really young, would sort of balance themselves out, right? Like you would have a lot of these nutrients and minerals and whatever else in the soil actively already, because it's self-developing from microbes and fungi and whatever, and the tree has everything it needs without our intervention. Would you say that's right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you'll see it in the growth of the tree, right? Like you'll see it when you look at, how much growth the tree is actually putting on, right? With the internodes, from the first node, say, to the tip of the branch. If the trees are growing this much, whether it's an evergreen or a deciduous tree, then that's a feedback mechanism to you. Okay, this tree is under stress, and we have to look at the whole system. And usually it starts in the root zone, right? Like that or, if it's during the growing season, we can see the foliage, we can see that it's kind of chlorotic. Maybe there's interveinal chlorosis, so the veins are maybe, just green and the rest of the foliage is yellow. Like, okay, so we know it's suffering from a nutrient deficiency. Or sometimes that chlorosis and interveinal chlorosis can be not enough air pore space in the root zone, and we've had a really wet year. There's a lot of trees that will turn chlorotic when there's just too much water in the root zone as well. It's another stress response sometimes too.
Yeah, it's like trees are trying to show us a sign, and you can't take that one sign. And that's what we should look for as arborists and whatever is, I think, just something that looks abnormal. You don't have to tell you exactly what to look for, but if something doesn't look right, try and figure out what that is, and then recognize that that's something out of balance or it's lacking, likely in the soil, which is where everything generally comes from. So like, I guess even with humans, like coughing is a sign, but coughing can be caused by so many different things, right? We can't just say coughing is caused by the fact that I have asthma, and then just start treating asthma. So if we can treat things on a broader spectrum, hopefully from the ground up, the root problem, you're probably fixing a multitude of problems, and then eventually the tree will overcome those. And I know it's hard for me too, especially because you try and incorporate some of these solutions for people on a tree where it's already kind of 50-50. Should we remove it? Should we keep it? The soil's crap. It's like some of these amendments where I want them to spend their money and time in the root zone versus pruning it, because they usually just call you to prune it. And you're like, well, it's going to add more stress to the tree, and it's already trying to fight whatever's going on. Let's work on the soil and the roots. But, how much time does it need before it's going to be able to remedy and get some things in there right away? I don't know. With my methods, probably a little more passively and slower. But if you have access to an air spade, or this deep root fertilizing injector tool, that kind of thing, that sounds a lot more immediate. Hey, like you might get something kind of now.
Immediate, yeah. You can have a faster response, and that it's really doing the job and increasing like that air pore space and water pore space. Like in an ideal soil should be like up to 50% of the soil should be pore space for air and water, and we know that most of our urban soils are not doing
not 50.
Not 50.
Yeah. So going back to the arborist showing up at the house, and the tree's too deep in the ground, we can't replant it. But if you do have the opportunity to plant the tree with them or explain to them for the next tree they're going to plant, I think a lot of the problem is that people see the soil line on the tree where it's already too deep from being in a pot or the burlap sack, and it's just sat there for a while until it got sold, and maybe they've added some organic matter when it says past hands down the line, and you get it home, and so they're just like, oh, there's the line, let's put it at that line, because they just don't know any better. So if the tree's already in the ground, you don't have an air spade, I guess you can dig it out by hand gently without scratching the bark. That's what I recommend to people. But
that's what's nice about the air spade, right? Because it's the air spade doesn't hurt the plant tissue or the root tissue, so we can actually, air spade excavation is used to go into, say, the root system of a plant where someone wants to put a conduit in, like a service line for something, or they want to dig a footing, or they are doing home construction. We'll use our air spade to expose the roots and then properly prune them off at the edge of the zone of excavation construction. We'll do that as well. But yeah, it's the least potentially invasive way to be able to expose the root flare. You could potentially use a stream of water to wash the soil away from the root too. But like high pressure, you could potentially strip off some bark with a high pressure washer, right? So it'd have to be really at a low setting or just using like a regular stream of water from a hose attachment.
Okay, and then get rid of that landscape fabric. So you have to pull back the mulch or the rock or whatever crap you got growing on there. Let that oxygen get in there. And then, so if they have a kind of a crappy soil and some, maybe there's some smells from some anaerobic decomposition or whatever's going on in there, hopefully it's going to start to remedy here. But what do you recommend doing now as far as correcting the situation? We've exposed the root flare a bit, got rid of the fabric. Let the
soil, honestly, let that top of the soil dry out, and those anaerobic organisms will die off. And then, I would be using like a natural mulch that you can find. And that's, you're talking about mulches, and a lot of people, like not a lot of people, but some people, they see the different colored mulches in the garden center or the landscape supplier, like the deep black and that brick red kind of color. And those are dyed. So those are dyed to look that way. So you think about it, if you add that mulch to your garden, all the dyes that were used in that process are going to be leaching out into the soil, and chances are they're not food for the microbes, right? So it's something that is probably not the best thing to be doing, is dyeing our mulches. So using mulches that are just in the natural state is going to be a lot more advantageous and supportive to the microbiome in our gardens. I went off on a tangent. What was the question?
No, that's good.
Again?
It's all right. I got you. We're kind of walking through the arborist showing up and being now a tree health advocate here. So we've got there where like Jen said I should expose that root flare. So they've exposed the root flare on the tree that's existing. They pulled back the landscape fabric for this little old lady who didn't know any better. She just moved into the house, right? She wants to make it better. She loves her tree. Yes. It kind of smells funny. Usually if there's a bad smell, it means there's anaerobic decomposition, which means obviously there's not enough oxygen there, and there could be predatory microorganisms. Like things are snowballing in the wrong direction, I like to tell people. So we need to reverse it, kind of bring it back to the good direction. So we take that out. You said let it dry out, which is cool. Like for me, it's dry here all the time.
Just the top layer, like just to let that top layer dry out, not the whole soil or anything, but and then
so a couple days maybe.
Yeah, and then just top dressing with a light mulch, like a thin layer and a light mulch, just to sort of encourage. So you're still having that air exchange, with the atmosphere and everything, but you're still starting to provide a food source. And who's going to come in there first? The decomposing, recycling fungi and bacteria that want to use that mulch as a food source. And so it's like you're putting food down to start that whole system.
Feed them, yeah.
And those are keystone organisms. Those are the organisms that are going to start the whole system that's going to support all of the plants, in that garden situation. Leaf litter is the best. If you can get leaf litter, that's always the best. And when the leaves fall on our property, we mulch them with the mower and collect them and then put them on the gardens, because that's,
it's a natural input. Right from your area with your native organisms on it.
It's beautiful. Yeah.
So do you recommend maybe putting on like a nice compost first after you've kind of exposed, to kind of layer it in, compost and then a mulch?
Yes, absolutely. If you can, like if you're actually, removing the remnants of the previous mulch and you can get some compost in there, that's a beautiful thing. Absolutely do that first, and then you can mulch on top. But leaf litter is the best. And, worms, like we talked about, those worms, they'll be in there feeding on the leaf litter, making, that beautiful humus, the beginning of humus for the soil. And they're also making channels in the soil for air and water to move. And roots can grow into those channels under the soil too.
One cool recommendation I think I came up with for people, because we have like little forest stands and things like that all over Cochrane and whatever, is that they want to try and do this remedying of their tree and their environment underneath their tree. And I think, you can go and buy compost and whatever, imported from whatever, but, a lot of the organisms, and I'd like you to obviously go off here on a tangent about what compost is and the different types, maybe what makes one better than the other. But I'll tell them, if you have a little forest right behind your house, you could maybe dig down into that duff layer and get the naturally composted stuff that's right there, because it's native organisms, everything's adapted, they're probably alive. You're not just putting in like a humus kind of like layer of some food for the microorganisms, but it's also pre-inoculated with a lot of these organisms. So you might need to just take a little bit of it and spread it out in that area, but with more food, and then they'll just repopulate and start to break down your mulch or whatever it might be. But yeah,
that's a fantastic recommendation. So you're inoculating with things like mycorrhizal fungi when you can take a sample from the forest, especially where there's tree species that are growing that are similar to the tree species that you're hoping to inoculate. And, nursery growers actually do that. And oaks are probably one of the best examples of that because they can be really tricky to grow. They're really kind of fussy, and whether it's container or field, they can be hard to transplant and really sensitive in their root systems. And so I've known lots of nursery growers that would take some soil from oaks growing in a forested area and then using that as inoculum in their plant production systems. And just like, it's just nature's medicine, just moving that population, dispersing, that successful organism over into this new microbiome, this soil biome.
Right.
Is a great idea. I'm glad you said that.
Thank you. Can you give us a basic rundown of what compost is, if people don't know, or what would make a better compost than not?
Okay, so compost is just basically dead or dying plant tissue in most cases. And plant tissue is usually really high in carbon. So wood and mulch, but wood especially is like really super high in carbon. So really high carbon, very low nitrogen. And when bacteria and other microbes are breaking down, say wood or dead plant material of some sort, they also need nitrogen to be able to break it down and then form this organic source of nutrients, right? So it's important to have a nitrogen source in your compost. And so a lot of compost manufacturers will add nitrogen to the compost so that the materials can be broken down and the carbon can be broken down. They'll basically they'll have it at temperatures. They'll turn the pile. They'll aerate the pile because a lot of the decomposers and recyclers, they need air in order to function. They're not anaerobic, so they'll turn those piles. The piles get really, really hot from all that thermal production, that heat production. And they'll age it for a certain amount of time, and sometimes they'll aim for a certain carbon to nitrogen kind of ratio depending on where it's going. So some of that is going to be going to grow nursery trees in container production, but we can also use it even just in our backyards, and it's basically an organic source of the nutrients that plants and other organisms need as a food source. So
Nice.
Really simply put, anything, that's why kitchen scraps, dead poinsettias from Christmas, like any kind of plant-based material that you just, don't have a purpose for anymore, or it's rotted or whatever, composting is a fantastic source of nutrients. And it normally naturally happens, but in our pristine, perfect garden and, parks and places that there's no space for it in the system, so we have to add it in.
Right. Yeah, I love worm castings too, by the way. I know that's kind of hard to do on a large volume scale, but it's something people can do year round, and they can do it indoors and add it to house plants or that kind of thing. So, or
you can add, again, mowing your leaf litter at the end of the season and adding it into your garden will feed that worm population that you already have, and you'll have even more worm activity and your own, vermiculture going on in your own garden system.
Yeah, so if people can realize that, like, because there are trees and their plants, even as best as they try and do to follow like this advice, or they're into these practices, it's still not a forest. And even our forests are struggling, right, to keep this balance right now. So that's where we have to make these interventions and add things back in. And it may not be, a tree that's fallen down. It's going to take 100 years to decompose because we're not in a forest here. But that's where we bring in the mulch, the stuff that's pre-chipped up, or the compost that's already broken down, and add it. So underneath the mulch is kind of what I recommend. Or I say, you could mix it in a bucket with some water to make like an extract. And then if you already have mulch in place and you don't want to till, like we were already talking about, because you don't want to disturb that whole development of the mycorrhizal fungi, which can take a lot more time to develop. So you want to kind of leave it and let these layers slowly break down. You can make an extract and then pour it over top of the mulch and then let it kind of soak in for that more high surface area, immediate fuel or food for the trees and microorganisms underground.
And like you were kind of almost alluding to, like keeping that biomass on the property as much as possible to feed, those organisms is really important. Like a lot of people, they want every leaf gone, every stick gone, every, thing gone.
Yeah.
And the more that we can actually leave on the property, it's going to be a nutrient source and feed that whole plant food web again. And
it's a free input.
Yeah.
Right there.
Yeah, exactly. And it's less expensive for you to leave the wood in some form on the site than it is to haul it away. So that's one incentive that we can do for our customers, that they can reduce the cost. Yeah. And that usually gets really interesting for a lot of customers.
Yeah, you can recycle right on site essentially. And this makes me think of people too here, especially you get a lot of customers asking about like trimming their spruce trees because they think, everyone else on the block's done it. So I need to trim up the whole 4 feet from the ground on my spruce. And again, I'm like, think about what's natural. Is it natural? No, nature doesn't do that. Nature grows these spruce boughs all the way down to the ground because they're providing shade and they're decreasing the wind through there to help retain moisture for their own root systems. And then it allows these needles to fall off as they do somewhat naturally on different cycles to the ground to create their own mulch layer, and then left undisturbed can then break down and provide food for themselves to keep growing. But when we cut the branches up, now we're allowing sunlight in there and they're getting pounded with UV rays. So things start to die off, they start to dry, the wind comes through. Then the people can see the needles and weeds or whatever else is maybe growing or not growing under there. And they start cleaning it out and raking it out, to make it all look nice or they think they're supposed to do this. So it's like, if you understand how these systems work, and allow that organic matter maybe to collect in there. So if people plant more densely, all throughout their gardens or whatever, or you're there to prune, maybe don't prune it so cleanly that they can all of a sudden see the organic matter building up. Let's like try and disguise that organic matter along the ground so it can kind of build up and not get blown away.
And limbing up our trees, like our spruce and our pines in that way, we open up the whole circulatory system of the tree, right? The sap flow. And right then, as soon as we make that pruning cut, there's going to be, potentially microbes, but potentially pathogens that can land on that and have easy access into the tree that they wouldn't have already. And there's a lot of insects that would be attracted to all of that. So we have a pest called pine pitchmass borer here in Ontario, and I'm sure it's in other provinces as well, that the females would be preferentially attracted and would lay their eggs in those wounds. And so, we have to think about every time we make a cut.
Yeah, why?
We have to think about why are we doing this? Is there any disease organism or pest that would be attracted to this cut right now? So if we're pruning apple trees or pear trees, there's a disease called fire blight, which is bacterial.
Yeah, we have lots of that out here.
Yeah, there you go. Every time you make a cut, fire blight, if it's in the area, it will come into the cut of the system. It gets into the main stem of the tree and cankers, and it causes this. It can get into the tree systemically, and it's actually lethal. And a lot of people don't realize.
I think blight means to kill rapidly or something.
Yeah, it does. The shoots kind of collapse very, very quickly. It normally can get in through the flower and then get into the stem that way if the conditions are right. But if we make a cut during the active growing period for apple and pear, we are most likely going to have fire blight. And we see this where people are pruning fruit trees. So fruit trees should never be pruned anytime from May to September, if possible. I mean, if it's storm damaged or something like that, we have to do, but really avoiding. We have oak wilt now showing up in southern Ontario. So we don't prune oak trees during the growing season anymore because we don't see the trend. We don't want to open that tree up to. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and it's all pointing towards don't do this stuff when trees are awake and alive and producing and whatever, because that's when the insects and these bugs or pathogens will hit the trees.
That's right.
So,
and we really have to be cognizant of those really sensitive species. And if we do have to prune because, again, of storm damage or something like that, we'll actually use rubbing alcohol on the cut.
Clean your,
On the cut. The rubbing
tree?
alcohol hastens or speeds up the drying up of the wounds, because wounds will dry up within a few days, maybe 3, 4, maybe 5 days at the most, but that's how long they'll kind of stay open, and then they dry up so that they don't become a sink or a food source or as much of a target for especially like diseases, bacteria or fungi. So by spraying the alcohol on the wound, it dries the wound up a little bit faster, and so it can reduce the chances of getting a systemic disease. And so this is one of the things that we do as arborists here to reduce that during the growing season if we have to prune something that's vulnerable to disease, for instance.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I mean, it's tricky because, at least for me, I get all of my calls to do tree work all during the summer, the growing season, right? So to run a business, we have to prune during the summer. And of course, I don't want to remove a tree if we don't have to. So then the next option is pruning, but pruning, causes stress on a tree. So I sometimes battle with that as to whether it's like, when I zoom out with my perspective far enough, I can pretty much talk myself out of business completely, unless it's a storm or a danger type situation. But I can almost justify not pruning or doing anything to trees almost all of the time, because it's like, well, it's natural. This would happen, whatever. Oh, I'm going to prune that off. It's just going to cause a big old unnatural open wound on the tree, and then this and that. So I think it's a risk versus benefit situation for a lot of people. Or if you have to prune, maybe your volume is reduced and you do a small amounts over a period of years. Unfortunately, so many trees I prune though, where you're hitting your max volumes because it's the one and only time that tree is ever going to see an arborist. So you have to make do with what you have. But
so many, property owners don't realize that these trees, I mean, like you're saying, to really keep them healthy and reduce the chances of stress on them, is that we're pruning, we're going in and we're pruning, every third year, maybe every second year, maybe every fourth year, depending on, and we're taking little bits. See, and another part of this is a lot of people don't realize that all of the hormones that would signal root production or growing roots, they're produced in the canopy.
Okay.
And the hormones that signal shoot production are produced in the root system. And so that's why, Ed Llewellyn, who is an incredible horticulturalist with the University of Florida for many years, he retired, but we still use his resources all the time. He recommends that you actually don't prune the canopy of a newly planted tree for at least 3 years, maybe 4, maybe even 5. But you give it
around the roots.
Yeah, because the more you reduce that canopy, the less signal that it's signaling for root production. We want it to grow that root system, as much of a root system as possible in the first 3 years. So putting in a new hedge, putting in a new tree, as arborists, as educated arborists that are learning from these incredible people who have all this experience observing this for many decades, we really shouldn't be pruning that canopy, touching it for at least a few years if possible.
And planting.
Newly planted trees.
Right. And planting in the fall would make more sense as well, because the root's not going dormant. The canopy is going to sleep and going dormant, that when you plant a tree in the fall, it would have more time to sort of establish and work on, use its energy reserves to establish a root system underground, as opposed to planting in the spring when it's using a lot of energy to try and break open its buds and do flower production or whatever those phenology cycles would be. But it's also trying to fix its newly established or newly planted roots.
Spring, according to research and according to my observations, spring is still the best time to plant a tree.
Plant?
Is it really?
It really
is.
Why is that? Is it just because of the moisture then, or
Yeah,
the fact you're
a
getting
lot
more
of it has to
sun?
do with the soil is a lot more moist in the spring. So there's the water that it needs to be able to really pull up that water and expand that canopy. Right now, it's really interesting. So we are, well, I don't know, our maple syrup season this year has been pretty, early stop and start. The temperature differentials between night and day have been not great because we've had such a mild winter here. But, this time of year normally, or a little bit earlier, there's actually photoreceptors in the dormant bud of, say, like a sugar maple tree. And those photoreceptors can perceive the change, the light intensity, even though it's this little tiny bud of a leaf covered in all of these scales and protected. It can actually perceive the light intensity, and it will send a signal down to the root system right now to say, hey guys, spring is coming. I need some water and I need some sugar. Can you please send it up? So the root system gets this signal, and the root system takes the starches that are stored in the root system and uses an enzyme, amylase, to cleave them into more smaller molecules, which are sugars, and basically makes all this sugar from this stored starch in the root system. And it changes the osmotic potential. It changes kind of like the water potential, and it becomes a sink. The root system becomes a sink for water that's in the soil. So it can passively, without having to expend any energy, absorb a whole bunch of water in with these carbohydrates, and then they start going up the conductive tissues in the tree up to those buds to start those buds off that need a ton of water, and they need carbohydrates because they're just this little primordial leaf that needs a lot of energy and water to be able to expand into a full leaf. And it's just amazing that they're talking to each other, even this time of year, and that's what's going on. That's why when you prune a maple tree in the spring, they bleed. They call it bleeding. There's so much sap that comes out. It can bleed for days on end.
Yeah.
And that's because there's sugar that's mobilized down there, and it's pulling a ton of water from the soil, and then, to push canopy growth. So we harvest some of that sap. We make it into maple syrup and make maple sugar and all those delicious things that I love very much. And then after a while, that there's enough so that the trees start to bud out. And once the trees start to actually, bud out or head towards that process, we stop harvesting the sap. It doesn't taste as good anymore, and it's just all about growth. And then once those leaves start photosynthesizing, they send that sugar back down to restore all the storage in the root system and the bowl of the tree too. So there's a whole conversation that's going on inside the plant. They're talking to each other, and we come along and we want to say excavate for a new patio, or we want to prune off a big branch because it's hanging too close. My neighbor's complaining it's hanging over their yard. We're off kiltering the balance, like you're saying. So the less pruning that we can do in one season, the much easier it's going to be on the tree. It really is. And if we can take the time for some of our customers to explain those things, so they become educated, they become invested, they care about their trees, when they better understand these organisms, they can make more informed decisions and really listen to their educated arborists such as you to say, okay, I trust you. You're not trying to rip me off by coming here more often than you need to or something like that. It's because you care about the trees, and this is in their best interest.
Yeah, and I think by having that mindset too, of having the tree in their best interest, and showing your clients that that's why you're there, and you're not trying to go after them for money, or just make it a straight business transaction. Mm-hmm. It comes back to you like in karmatic ways or whatever, that you're just doing good, and you'll get other business and get lots of word of mouth, and then they believe in you and trust in you and build a good relationship. There's just so many other things that I think come from it, and then the tree's going to be healthier too, obviously. Hopefully you're in arboriculture because you care about the trees.
Yeah.
not just to make money, but
Yeah.
I'm sure there are people out there that just run a good business too and just don't know, but maybe not because they probably don't want to, or they're bad people or something. It's just they just maybe don't understand, or they haven't gone down these roads yet. And at least for me too, I noticed in the beginning, I had to focus on basics, like how to be safe, what PPE do I need, how do I actually cut a tree down, because it was something I didn't have to fully understand on a deep level yet. It was just the mechanics of, okay, cut this branch, gravity, pull it down. I can't screw anything out because the tree's getting removed anyways, right? So a lot of us are there, and we all get paid well for doing that. But then you get into pruning, and then the questions start coming, and then it evolves, and then here we are talking about when to plant a tree and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's just part of the evolution. So I try not to think about other arborists that are maybe just tree slayers as bad or anything. They're at where they're at, and that's cool. But hopefully we can get everyone on the same page as time goes on.
With podcasts and other educational opportunities such as these, this is becoming so accessible, this information. You don't have to pay to go to a post-secondary institution necessarily for this. You can work through organizations such as the International Society of Arboriculture, or there's so much great information out there.
Yeah, it's great. It's a little masterclass with Jen here. I appreciate you coming on for that. Okay, let's rip back then we're at the property. We've got that compost down there, right? We're going to put some mulch on it now. We said we're not going to do the mulch volcano around the tree, but perfect world. How much mulch would you put down, and what sort of method? What kind of mulch?
We like to put down somewhere between 5 and 8 centimeters, so 2 to 3 inches at the most, because too much mulch can again block the air exchange with the between the soil and the atmosphere, which is a problem. And we will use. It depends on the customer too, and what they want. Sometimes we'll use composted pine shavings that almost looks like a compost, and we'll use that knowing that we have to go in the following year and do that on an annual basis.
So maybe less and more frequently adding it if it's a finer material, because that would make sense. It's going to compact more or less air exchange. Whereas a bulkier mulch, you could probably go a little thicker.
You could go a little thicker, and you could come in every second year, or maybe just come in annually and just top up some bare spots that have more water erosion associated with them and stuff like that. Just anything as natural as possible. And if it is something that breaks down, we might do deep root fertilizer with our full spectrum product in there as well. And again, that's going to provide the nitrogen. We also encourage our homeowners to use natural nitrogen sources like blood meal and things like that. So it just depends on the homeowner and how much they want to be involved, because some really, really want to be involved, which is fantastic. Yeah. I love it. And then, I'm the kind of person who gets out my hand lens, and we're looking at things together, and they're using my hand lens, and I'm showing them how to find all this stuff. And it's beautiful. It's beautiful to see people that want to connect back to the land. And that's a big part of my job, to try to facilitate that. So
what do you think about using our mulch? I mean, you're there and you got a bucket or a truckload of mulch from the area full of buds and needles and bark and this and that.
It's just going to have a really super high carbon to nitrogen ratio. So as it starts to break down, the microbes are going to pull nitrogen out of the soil to help use that carbon source as a food source to break it down. So we can use our mulches, but we have to add nitrogen
to the mulch
under the soil, because
the soil.
It's under the soil. I mean, you could potentially add it to the mulch too, but it needs to be in the lowest layer where the degradation is going on, right? At the soil.
This has always been tricky for me to try and understand, and I've had so many different answers on it, but my last conclusion from all of this, and hopefully you can kind of clear it up, is that the significance of nitrogen that's being pulled from the soil was sort of blown out of proportion, and that people, would then all of a sudden make decisions to not put a mulch layer down or not do these things because they're like, oh, it's bad. It's going to pull nitrogen out of the soil. Everything's going to be ruined. But it was like, okay, we're getting off track here from the proper mindset. Like still doing mulch, putting mulch down, organic products, even if it's not perfect, it's still way, way better than not doing any of those things. And then what I was told anyway was that the amount of nitrogen that it needed from the soil was not as much as we were kind of building up, and that activity was happening just within like millimeters on the top of the soil. Like it wasn't really affecting anything. So it was kind of like a bit of a myth. What could you say about that? Because I hear all things about it.
Well, I know from my experience in container production where, these materials are used as part of the container media, the soilless media in containers. If it hasn't been aged long enough and the carbon to nitrogen ratio is too high, we'll see chlorotic plants in containers like within weeks of potting. In the soil, you're right, there's a bit more of a buffering capacity, and it's a bit more regional in terms of pulling nitrogen out of the soil. It's not like a container at all. It's completely different. So it will be zonal, and it would be anything growing in that top layer of soil that would potentially be deficient in nitrogen.
That top layer is where a lot of our root growth is happening, right? And that's that duff layer where we're getting a lot of those nutrients. So if we're deficient in nitrogen, that kind of sucks. So what would you recommend as far as a prescription? So would you say there's enough nitrogen in that compost that they had put down, or would you recommend supplementing with an organic nitrogen source on top of that compost and then the mulch layer, from the arborist truck, because it hasn't been aging?
Right. So I would definitely add a compost source that has nitrogen in it. So something like even like a manure, although they have phosphorus too, but adding in composted manure is a way of getting some nitrogen into that layer so that there's something else to pull from besides the soil. So it's just that anything that's completely raw and never been composted, such as bark, such as wood, mulch, that's going to have a really high carbon. So you need to add some sort of a nitrogen source. So the nice thing about the compost materials that we can buy is they will have the analysis on the bag. They're usually kind of low in nitrogen, but it is a way. I mean, feeding again with blood meal has a little bit more nitrogen. That's a lot more compared to say like a traditional compost. And it's not something that you have to do every year either. It's just as you put that fresh, high carbon ratio product down, just think about having either some compost underneath it or potentially blood meal.
So as time goes on, say you're back and you're doing this property again for the second year, the third year, maybe you have a stockpile of mulch out at a farm like I do. Yes.
Nice.
And it's sitting there and it's been breaking down for a couple of years. So there's a nice layer of mycorrhizal fungi forming in the mulch, and it is breaking down into finer material. Would you say nitrogen is less needed in that situation because it's had time to go through some of those processes?
Yeah.
Okay.
It is.
And then by topping it up each year, could you just safely put on fresh stuff each year if you're just kind of top dressing?
If you're just top dressing, yep, because the microbial layer will be in that zone below it.
Okay.
So yeah.
So these are more considerations to add in a little bit of nitrogen when you're kind of starting fresh there with that when you're remediating some new areas.
And again, it's especially where you've got herbaceous perennials or ground covers or any kind of shallow rooted plants in that area.
Gotcha.
They're the ones that are going to suffer. The tree roots are growing probably, there's tree roots growing in the top 15 centimeters, but they're not typically growing in the top 4 to 6 centimeters of the soil. They're usually down below that a little bit. But that first 15 to 30 centimeters of soil is where most of the tree roots would be growing.
Okay, awesome. And you made me think of the next thing there is that like we don't have to stop there with just wood chip mulch and edging and this perfect little tree in the front yard. But we can add more plants, some living mulch, I guess you could say, or companion planting or plant guilds, whatever you want to call it. What do you recommend, and could you explain all that, the benefits of that?
This is something that I'm doing a deep dive into now, going forward, because, like all the research is showing about these underground networks, and root systems will also graft together between different plants. I mean, usually the same species, but the root systems themselves will graft together. They're just built for these kind of relationships. So when we look out in the forest, sugar maples, we're going to find sugar maples out there. We're going to find ironwood. We're going to find ash trees, potentially in some of the edges. Quite often we see maple beech forest, American beech here, growing together in those associations. We might find hemlock, depending on the soil, the ecosystem, maybe some spruce white pine, and just trying to mimic those kind of companion plantings.
Like, it's not just trees in the forest.
Mm-hmm. There's going to be serviceberry growing on the edges. There's going to be things like pussy willow, alders. I'm sure you guys have lots of alders out there. And those are companion plants for some of these other tree species. So by having, trees and shrubs together in these systems, and then ground covers around them, all putting carbon into the soil, all feeding the microbiome together, and all building this supportive network. I think it's that's kind of a thing is what we really, that's where plants thrive. And you think about, even when you think about like old estate properties that you go on that haven't been managed or tended in like decades, and where you see the group plantings, those plants are usually doing really well, and no one's done anything mulched, weeded, or anything, and they're still thriving. I wonder if it's just because that there's that community.
Totally. Mm-hmm. I agree 100%. This is where my intuition leads me. This is where, when I connect the dots from different learnings I've done, has all led me, and it makes sense. Like, planting a tree in an urban environment by itself or in a row, whatever it might be, as the same species, is like the opposite of what's natural or organic or diverse, whatever those three things I always think about. But there are little areas, like in Cochrane now too, where they're doing it, and there's a little patch, and they'll create like a large bed, and then there'll be like a poplar, a spruce, some caragana, some potentillas, and then some native grasses, maybe some kinnikinnick or little ground cover lying things, which kind of cover over the mulch. And things thrive there as opposed to surviving. And I don't know why it's not done more. It makes so much sense to me if you cover the ground, because we said it before, bare soil is the worst thing you can do. So obviously having a diversity of different plants and species all together is like the opposite of that. They're all contributing their carbon down into the ground. They're feeding more of a diversity of microorganisms and fungi under there. We don't even know how different fungi and different microorganisms from different plants probably work together and are symbiotic as well underground, right? Then we're creating more shade on the soil. We're collecting more organic matter, less wind and things blowing through there, more habitat for birds, more habitat for other above ground microorganisms and things like that. Of course, there's like disease and all that kind of stuff that still comes in, but that stuff kind of comes in balance. And when you have diversity above the ground, you don't have an emerald ash borer wiping out your whole row of ash trees, because you have these guilds, these companion plants, everything all growing together. So they're more robust against disease. And if something does have to come down over time, it can slowly be replaced at different heights. It's not aesthetically looking strange because they're all the exact same tree plant at the exact same time. Like, and you don't need landscapers coming in there mowing, and digging stuff back. You don't have to add as much organic matter. Like, it's cheaper in the long run. Sorry, that's my dog. So he agrees, I think. So I'm loving these group plantings that we're doing. I think it should be done more often.
I think that's exactly what we're going to see. And, I'm...
Hi, Cooper. Or Hamish. Cooper's my old dog. I would call him Cooper.
I'm pretty excited to see all the changes, these positive changes and this different mindset. And like so many people are so much more interested in supporting the land and connecting to their land, to their property than they have been before. And it's a huge opportunity for all of us to play a greater role. We think of ourselves, or maybe we've been led to think of ourselves as being separate from nature, and we are we are wholeheartedly part of nature. We are meant to live and be in nature, and we can do a lot here to support the ecosystems that we live in, for sure.
Yeah. Support, I think, is the right way to think about it, right? We're not trying to control it, and not trying to think of some of these ecosystems or trees, whatever they might be, as like something that we own, like it's our possession, as opposed to like it's another living thing and let's support it in its natural way. Just, you don't even have to understand biology and all that stuff. Just like think about, oh, what kind of tree do I have in my front yard? Hopefully it's a native one because you've looked around in your area, and bought from a nursery where they bring in a native species. And how can you support it? What can you do? How would it grow in nature? Let's just do those things. And, things will probably work out well for you.
I have a front bed. It's got a European beech in it. And it's got serviceberry, so Amelanchier. It's got clethra, which is summer sweet. And I think it's got some non-native butterfly, Buddleia. And this tree is packed on a lot of caliper. It's probably into like maybe 14 centimeters DBH in like 7 years. That's pretty fast for European beech. And I think it's happy in its little community that it's growing in. And it's thriving and it's doing really well.
That's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're getting close to 2 hours here, so we should probably think about maybe planning another podcast, because we could go deeper on some of the stuff, maybe more specific topics. But as for some final advice from you, how do you think, as arborists here in the industry in general, how could we be doing a bit better? Maybe we've alluded to some of this already, but how would you like to see the industry sort of change as arborists and our involvement in tree care and these ecosystems and that sort of thing?
I think a lot of us are doing it, Kurt. Like, I think a lot of us are making the time and effort to go to meetings, to do educational things, and not just the ISA conferences and things, but there's also smaller groups. And there's a lot of arborists that are networking with each other behind the scenes, in their own kind of private mastermind groups, if you will. And maybe they're in like non-competing geographies. But I really think that if we can do more and have more relationships, professional relationships within this industry, that we become mentors to some of the younger arborists coming in. And I really think it's a matter of just forming more social networking and educational groups. Like this podcast is a really, really great place to start. But where I think we can really excel is if we do our own kind of mastermind groups, and that anybody who enters into the arboriculture industry automatically is eligible to participate in a mastermind group, and they're organized in this way, and there's a mentor, and then there's all of these other mentees. And this is something that I started doing in my role as the provincial specialist. I started mastermind groups for nursery growers, because when you grow up in a business, right, when it's your family business, quite often, you have been working in it since you were 10 years old, and it's kind of all you know. Like some awesome business people, they send their kids out to do an apprenticeship at another business, which can be, in another county, it can be in another province, it can be in another country, and then they work there for like 6 months to a year or a year and a half, and they get that kind of visual. But that's not very common in our culture. And so I think we need to form more, because we have apprenticeships that when you do arboriculture and you study it post graduate, so like as a college diploma, which most people have a college diploma in arboriculture that are running businesses here, you have that part of it, but then it kind of stops. So I think that there should be, whether you want to call them mastermind or mentorship or whatever you want to call it, groups. Because when I started doing that in the last couple of years in my role in the government, it was like huge what happened. And it wasn't just during those mastermind groups, it was all of the other sidebar communications that germinated outside of the group, so that this person who's grown up in his family business could now talk to another mentor that wasn't his parents or his grandparents or his aunts and uncles and cousins, and get another perspective, and vice versa. It was magical, the amount of problems that they were solving, just pooling all of that experience. So I would love to see something like that happen. And who knows, maybe that's even me involved in that. That would be a fun kind of side gig. I could totally do that.
I'd join that group. Yeah.
So like exactly.
So I guess what that could look like is some sort of probably online type connection. I mean, it's probably already happening to a degree.
Yeah, I'm
with
sure
these,
it
you know,
is.
Facebook groups and whatever. And I guess
But
there's a lot of them don't have
formal.
like a leader. Yeah, something a little more formal, maybe with like regular contributions of information or whatever, and from some sort of like, you know, quote, trusted sources, as opposed to just throwing out any kind of criticisms out there and no one really in charge of that group. But I think there still is some probably really positive stuff that comes along in those groups that do exist, but something a little more formal would be cool. And I guess we're learning all too from trial and error. Like a lot of these problems that we're facing now with some pests and different things is as a result of the best we knew way back when these trees were all planted, and they've all grown up, and it's like, oh, okay, we didn't know this was going to happen, but maybe in the future let's fix this by planting more diversity in different groups and whatever, and then we'll have some more progress in 20, 30 years. I'll look back and be like, oh, okay, maybe this worked, you know, or maybe it didn't. I don't know. So,
but things are changing all the time, and they are getting better. A lot of things, a lot of improvements. Like, look at the biodiversity in our street tree plantings. It's like phenomenal compared to, 15, 20 years ago. So there is positive change going forward, but I think we could be even stronger and even wiser and more resourceful if we work together a little bit more.
Yeah. For sure. And I hate to spread that fear too. We're just talking to this perspective as if things aren't good and things are getting worse. I mean, because there's so much climate change pressure out there, all this kind of stuff, but everything just constantly, we're being inundated with this negative light that we're terrible and we're not doing things. But let's not forget, we're doing a lot of good things too. There are lots of good things coming. And I think, honestly, we can't, this is my own personal belief, is that a lot of these systems that we grow up in and a lot of our beliefs along this line are kind of laid out for us, and we just sort of go on believing it, but we don't really know what it's like in the rest of the country and the rest of the world and what people are thinking, what they're all doing. Like, there's no grand scope showing us all this all at once, and I think there's a lot more positive going on, and things aren't as bad as we actually kind of, put out there or we're led to believe. And I'm not saying nothing's not real. I'm not like conspiracy, whatever, but I'm just saying it's great to think of things in a positive light, give ourselves some credit, and keep pushing towards that hope and working together and make things better. We can always make things better, even if they're great already. But let's not like, think it's all over or something. That's what I'm trying to get at.
No.
Yeah, and nature knows. Nature's smarter than us, I think, too, on a grand scale, collectively. So it's going to be working on things. It already is. It's figuring stuff out.
I mean, I really believe that too, and I think that the Earth and the biosphere is very resilient. And maybe we're just the weakest link. But I don't know.
Yeah, I think we're part of it. I think everything is the way it should be right now. Everything's right on time. And
this is the adventure. This is the journey.
Adventure. Sometimes things happen for a reason beyond what we can understand, and on a grander scale. We're only here for a blink so far compared to the history of these plants that have been around forever.
That's
So
right. Yeah.
sometimes it's good to think, we always have our own perspectives that we're the most important, but if we can shift it just slightly, that we're part of a greater ecosystem, can maybe alleviate a lot of strife in your life.
That's right. And along that theme, I'm a second generation Canadian in my maternal line, right? My family hasn't been here for very long. I'm not sure about yours, but we have to also remember that, the indigenous peoples of this land hold great wisdom, great knowledge. They have been in relationship to all these kingdoms of life for thousands of years on this land, and they hold great knowledge and wisdom, and it's beautiful when we see more and more researchers that are studying these natural systems with an indigenous elder or indigenous or scientist or both on the team, getting full recognition,
Yep.
having full influence on the projects and why. Like even the mother tree concept, that's something that has been in indigenous wisdom for thousands of years. They've known that. The scientists are just sort of proving what already indigenous wisdom exists out there. But for some people, it didn't need to be proved. So
totally. And I think it also comes down to this mindset that we're brought up into, that especially with Western culture, or maybe non-indigenous, I don't know what you want to call it, but is that we think we need to learn it somewhere in a textbook and in school. You're highly academic. I appreciate learning things in books and from other people that are masters or whatever, but it's not the only way to learn. But we kind of chalk up people in our society, whatever, is that like you have to have this credential. And as soon as you're a doctor in something, it's like, oh, you're the expert. And they're all the same once they've hit that level. But really, getting back to indigenous people, they may not have a formal system that they've done scientific Western style studies on everything for the past thousands of years to all of a sudden present to us. And it's like that's our expectation. And if they don't have that, then it's like, well, we don't believe you just because you've been sharing it in stories or through experience. And all of a sudden that doesn't matter. But it's like, maybe there is other ways to learn, which I believe wholeheartedly there are. And not everything comes from these textbooks. So again, taking those people, the people that have lived here for years and years and years, on their experiences and what they've done, can hold a lot of merit, So that's my 2 cents anyway.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks, Jen.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it. And if people want to find you, I alluded to it quickly in the intro, but you are at Greenbird Hort on Instagram, correct?
Yep.
And your website is greenbirdhort.com. Is that correct?
That's me.
Okay.
Yep.
That's where people can find you. And then your app, again, what was that called? The BugFinder?
It's called BugFinder, and it's all one word. There's no space, so just BugFinder, all one word.
Excellent. Yeah. And that book you were kind of alluding to there with the mother tree, that was Suzanne Simard, Simard. She's the forest ecologist scientist from University of British Columbia who wrote that. And another great book is The Hidden Kingdom by Keith Seifert, who's another amazing scientist, Canadian. He grew up in Northern Ontario, beautiful person. And those 2 books are great. And for anybody who's really interested in the whole ecology and Indigenous wisdom, there's a wonderful book that's quite famous as well. Probably most people have heard of Braiding Sweetgrass. Oh, yeah, that's on my list. That keeps coming back to me, but I don't dive in.
She's incredible. So it's Robin Wall Kimmerer. She's just this wonderful person, and if you like Audible, she reads her own book, and so does nice. Suzanne Simard. They read their own books. So for me, I'm very auditory, so I love it.
Yeah. I know. I'm not really a big fan of the neutral readers, narrators, I guess you'd call them.
Yeah.
Paul Stamets, another person to look up. If you
Paul
like
Yeah.
podcasts, he was on Joe Rogan, I think, 3 times.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. He's
So,
incredible.
Big
yeah.
long podcast there, and he talks about all sorts of really cool stuff, and bees and
Yeah.
fungi and psychedelics, everything how ties together.
His website is Fungi Perfecti.
Oh yeah, cool.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's awesome. A couple of Netflix documentaries I like to throw out there too. Fantastic Fungi. It's a great one that's on Netflix. Kiss the Ground is another one. It's a little bit more along the regenerative agriculture spectrum, but you'll see a lot of similarities in things that we're talking about here because, I mean, plants essentially all grow the same. And whether you're talking about agriculture or forests or urban tree growing, like it's there's so many connections between all that stuff. Little Biggest Farm or Littlest Big Farm was a cool one too, where they regenerated some land from nothing and then started it all out and brought that biodiversity. It's a really cool documentary too to watch.
Yeah.
Awesome. Anything else or?
No, just say keep growing, keep learning, keep digging, chase these things that resonate with you, and you're not only going to find information that helps you, support the environment, the ecosystems more, but you're also going to find cool people like you. If it wasn't for me giving that talk, I wouldn't maybe have met you. And, I really love all the things that you're doing, so many incredible causes and so much energy you're putting into this. I really appreciate you, Kurt. It's an honor to be here today.
Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate you and you coming on. So it's great.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll have to connect again about this stuff. Yeah, if you have time, if we can pull you away from all the things you're up to. Okay.
Love to.
Well, take care, everybody. Don't hang up yet, Jen. I'm going to hit stop record, and we'll catch you all next time. Thanks again.